Howdy do, neighbor. It's Berean Spirits time once again. The boys have gathered around and they're ready for you. So join in, make comments, and study with the guys as they try to study as the Bereans did in Acts chapter 17. And now, here's the guys.
Welcome back to another episode of Berean Spirits here on YouTube, Facebook, podcast. My name is Chris Peltz. I'm the evangelist with the Southside Church of Christ here in Springfield, Missouri. Josh Thornhill is unable to be with us today, but don't worry, folks. It won't be for long. He will be back with us. I know some of you are ready just to flip that switch and turn us off because he's gone, but don't worry. He will be back.
Yeah, they call that one person mom. Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh, man. And of course, and that there is Richard Dotson with the Kearney Church of Christ. Richard, man, you throwing up all those links and inviting everybody to come and join us?
They've already been thrown.
Excellent, excellent.
Yep.
Well, for those who are listening, if you want to join the conversation and you are here live with us on Thursday morning, you can leave a comment, ask a question, you join the conversation. That's always great. We invite that and welcome that as well. Today, Richard, we're going to be talking about love. This is something that the Bible obviously discusses a lot, but usually folks think about the love of God, God's love towards us, which is, again, something that the Bible not only talks about, but is demonstrated throughout the scriptures and through the sacrifice of Christ Jesus. First John chapter, really just the entire book of First John talks about it, but chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, in this is love, not that we loved him, but that he loved us and gave his only begotten son to be a propitiation. So because of his love for us, we ought to love one another. And that is really what we're going to be talking about today, our love for one another, what kind of love, how that is defined and talked about in Scripture, specifically 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Richard, there's a few different words that are used in the Scriptures to talk about love. Phileo and agape are probably the two most prominent words that are used in Scripture to describe love. But probably I would say the most important of these would be that agape love, right?
Yeah, I never got into the Greek words. I mean, to me, love is love. I mean, you're totally devoted to God, and I've looked at those. I know what you're talking about. It's just not. It's just never meant anything to me when I studied it. So you can go ahead and hit it. But to me, if you put Jesus first, you're totally devoted to him.
Yeah, well, I mean, phileo is like, that brotherly love. Philadelphia is that's where the word that term comes from. The city of brotherly love, and that kind of love is really describing more of that kind of that fuzzy feeling, more of a emotion and relationship, husband and wife, more so probably. But that agape love is one that is a choice, a decision that is made in the respect that you're seeking to do what is best for those around you. And really, I mean, just getting into 1 Corinthians 13, it really shows how that love is not only manifest, but how it guides us, how it leads us, and the superiority of having a love not only for God but for those around us. Because when you talk about loving your enemies, you talk about loving those who hate you and those who curse you, and doing good to those who abuse you. That's going to take that agape type love. But just to jump into 1 Corinthians 13, Richard, he starts off in the first 3 verses to talk about kind of, not only acts of obedience, of selfless and selflessness, but he talks about his sacrifice to God, his work and duty towards God. And yet if he does it without love, it profits him nothing. his sacrifice to man, to give all that he has to those around him. Yet, but if he does it without love, it means nothing. And then, of course, his own willingness, to give his body to be burned. If he does it without love, it again means absolutely nothing. And so he's setting up the need and the thought about love, why it is needed, but then he kind of ends it in chapter 13, verse 13 of First Corinthians, to talk about how the greatest of these is love, even over not only miraculous spiritual gifts, but over faith and hope, because faith and hope are going to be done away with when Christ comes back to deliver the kingdom to the Father in heaven. No longer will we be living by faith. No longer will we be, having hope, because hope will be realized. Faith will be seen. They'll be done away with, but love remains. Love lasts eternally, and will be in heaven. And so he kind of bookends that. Regardless of our service here on earth, without love, it means nothing. And while everything else is done away with, everything else will come to an end, love is going to remain forever. And so we then jump into verses 4 through 8, where he really describes what love is all about.
Yeah, I don't think I think we'd be remiss in not mentioning the fact that before he gets into chapter 13, he'd really spent a lot of time talking about spiritual gifts.
Hmm.
And it almost appears that they had a problem thinking, one gift is better than another, because he goes into defining that, hey, we're all working together here. This is something that doesn't matter what your gift is. I mean, this is we work as a body, and he makes that comparison, uh, about each piece of the body, the finger and the hand and whatnot. I can't remember precisely which parts he used, but that's the comparison that he made. And then he gets into chapter 13, because it just seems to me like they were missing the point. And the point is love. And what's going to motivate us to take those gifts that they had back then, and to use it properly, love. What's going to motivate us to be obedient to God, love. All these things that he's bringing up there in before chapter 13 are they're leading to it. I mean, they're missing the whole point. If you go to Revelations chapter 2, starts off there with the church at Ephesus. And Chris, they were doing everything right. Mechanically speaking, everything was right. But he had something against them, because he said, you left your first love. And that love being Jesus Christ. And so, and I think that's really the point he's trying to get at here, is he's like, look, we have to have love. Love is the skeleton of the spiritual body. You have to have love, or it just profits you nothing. And that's what we see with that church at Ephesus. It profited them nothing to have those things. I do want to bring up a point, if I may.
Yeah.
And this is, there's two kinds of love that Jesus mentioned there in his Sermon on the Mount. And both of them are hard. One is just harder. And so when we're going through this and we're talking about love, I think we would be remiss in not pointing this out, that, love is not something the carnal man just knows how to do easily. This is something you got to work at. And remember, you're learning to be like the Son of God. At least, for me, it doesn't come naturally. It's something that's very difficult. But I do want to point out that Jesus talked about this in Matthew 5 and I think in verse 46, when you love those who love you. And he even mentioned that, what reward have you. Do not even the tax collectors do the same? Well, the tax collectors in Jesus's day were the scum of the earth. Nobody liked the tax collectors, but obviously they loved those who loved them. And he goes on to say, if you greet your brethren only, what are you more than others? And I think what he's trying to get at is the fact that even those outside of Christ practice that type of love. It's a natural affection that Romans 1:31 talks about. And so, what causes a child to love his parents? What causes the parents to love his child? And it's a natural affection, and it's you'll see it out in the world. But even with that, Chris, that's not always easy. I mean, you love your kids, I love my kids, but an example I would use is that I remember when one of my children was young, they just had a hard time sleeping. I mean, they'd wake up middle of the night and they just scream and scream and scream. And the only thing that I could do to calm them down is to put them in the car and drive around the neighborhood for hours, right? At least one of us, my wife, was getting some sleep. So you're driving around the neighborhood for hours. Your daughter is resting finally. And as soon as you stop the car, she's going to wake up. And you're driving around and you're tired and you're like, I mean, that's hard work. That's very hard work. And I remember thinking, what did I get myself into? But I still love my daughter. And that's just a natural affection. That's even though it was hard, you still do it. And non-Christians do the same. But Jesus, now we're going to talk about loving like Christ, because Jesus, as Emerald used to say, he kicks it up a notch. He says in verse 44, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. All right, Chris, that's a whole different level of love. Now we're talking about Christianity love. We're talking about the love of God. And this is something that we have to work for. If we don't pursue this, then it profits us nothing. And because that's the same kind of love Jesus showed us in Romans 5 and verse 10. We were enemies to God when he reconciled us by the cross. Before that, we were his enemies. And so we understand then that Jesus practiced that kind of love. And if you're going to be a disciple of Christ, you have to put yourself second, which you brought up earlier, and that was a good point about selfishness. You have to put yourself and your interests behind you and start thinking about what's good for other people, and especially what does your Father need? Because Jesus goes on in Matthew 20 and points that out about the importance of serving others. Hang on, let me read that. That's Matthew 20 and verse 25 through 28. Jesus called them unto him and said, you know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. And so when we're talking about this, Chris, we're talking about a whole different level of love than what the carnal man even understands. And this is something that, for me, has to be learned and practiced. And if we don't do this, if we don't apply this kind of love, then what's it going to profit us?
Yeah.
Nothing.
And we have the example of Christ, as you pointed out. And what's interesting, when you come back over to 1 Corinthians 13, as you pointed out from going back a chapter in chapter 12, and really, chapters 12, 13, and 14 of 1 Corinthians, all dealing with these miraculous spiritual gifts. And and all this arguing, all this, and he points out in chapter 13, all this is all temporal. Everything you guys are arguing about is temporal. It's carnal. You're focused on the wrong things. And he tries to get them to focus on love. And then he goes through and he not only describes love, but think about as he's describing, in verses 4 through 8, what love does and what it does not do. And you look at the entirety of the book of First Corinthians, for example, this is really, he's pointing the finger and saying, listen, where is this love when you're arguing about, you are of Cephas or of Apollos or of Paul, or where is this love when you're trying to, focus upon carnal things? Where's this love when you've got a brother caught up in sin who is, has his father's wife, and and you guys are even bragging about it when the Gentiles wouldn't brag about it? Where's this love when you're divorcing and treating your spouse, whether they're a believer or not, with contempt and indignation? Where's this love when you're talking about Paul and whether or not he's an apostle, what he can and cannot do, and trying to place these Pharisaical laws on them? Where's this love when you're gathered together to take the Lord's Supper, and you've got all these, these people who are, who are poor and without, and you've got these rich people looking down their noses, at all these others? Where's this love when you're arguing about the resurrection of Christ? Where is all of this? And so when you come to chapter 13, here they are arguing about miraculous spiritual gifts. Who has the better gifts? They thought it was tongues. And Paul says, you know what? I wish y'all would just be prophets, rather, have prophecy rather than tongue speaking, if we're going to choose a gift. But all of that even is for naught if you can't even love one another. And so now we come to chapter 13, and let's look at, Richard, if you would, how he describes love there in verses 4 through 8.
Well, okay, I can read this. It says, love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails.
Yeah.
And then he goes on and makes points about prophecies failing and things of that nature. Which you mentioned that already.
Yeah, but each one of those things is a direct rebuke of what they have been doing throughout this book that he's writing to them. Right? The envy, for example, right? There were some who were envious about their gifts, envious about who baptized them, envious about relationships. All of these things.
But if you're serving others,
yeah,
then where's the room for envy?
Well, that's just it.
Yeah, this is all part of bearing your cross, taking up your cross and following Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't envy others when he took up his cross. He took up his cross in service because we know John 3:16, he loved us.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to take up our cross, then, all these points that, that are brought up, then if we're going to take up our cross, it's impossible to do if you don't have these characteristics. You won't get it done. Not doing it properly. You're doing it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important for us to practice this. It's something that, like I said, it's hard. You have to transform your mind. No doubt about it. Romans 12. Yeah. You have to transform the way you think, but you have to do that if you're going to bear your cross.
Mm-hmm. That word kind, love is kind. A lot of times that word in and of itself is lost in translation because we think about being kind as just being polite, right? Just be nice to one another. And really that word has such a much deeper, the Greek is so much deeper than just being polite to one another. It is providing what is needed. It is doing what is best for those around you. And again, when you look at all of these things and you think about the rebuke that is taking place, think about they were taking one another to court and there in chapter 6, and the rebuke that he goes, there. Why were they doing that? They weren't being kind to one. They weren't doing what was best for one another. They again were being selfish. They were mistreating one another. They weren't helping one another. They weren't bearing with one another. All of these things that love and how it's described, and yet here they are. Um, and not just the Corinthians, right? Obviously, this is for all of this is, we find ourselves in some of the same situations that the Corinthians found themselves in. And Paul is giving us the answer right here. If we will make this application in our lives and how we look at and treat one another, right? That love your neighbor as yourself. Here is what it means and how it is put into practice in 1 Corinthians 13, then all everything else will just kind of fall into place.
Some passages that always made me have pause, and one such passage was what Peter said in 1 Peter 4:13, to rejoice that we partake of Christ's sufferings. And, I think Paul said basically the same thing in Colossians 1:24, I now rejoice in my sufferings for you, and fill up in my flesh what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ. I mean, if there is an attitude of Christianity where you are giving of yourself, and there's no room for selfishness. There's no room for some of these things that not being kind because of our want tos. If you have love, you want to be a servant for others. You want to be a servant for Christ. And so with that, you understand there's going to be persecution. If you're being persecuted, that's what happened to Jesus. And so if you receive that, then that what you're doing is right with God, but you're also, you want that. You want to give of yourself. I go back to Stephen in Acts chapter 7 when he gave up his life for the preaching of the gospel. He probably knew that if he gave such a fiery speech, this wasn't going to bode well. But he gave that speech, and we know that the one that they really feared, Saul, he was later known as Paul, he was there holding the coats of those who stoned Stephen. And so obviously, it was a very fearful thing, but yet he stood up boldly and proclaim God's word. What allows somebody to do that unless they think, I'm expendable. Even if I have to give up my life in service to my God, in service of my brethren, I'm expendable. And so even to try to save the lost, he was willing to get up there and preach so boldly, which, I've often looked at him, and as a preacher, I'm like, I sure hope I can do that too. But he gave of himself, and the only reason could possibly be is because he had that love that Jesus, or that the Apostle Paul, Jesus is letting be known through the Spirit, through the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. He had that love. And he wasn't doing it of himself. He was doing it for Jesus and all these others. And that's what we really have to ask ourselves, Chris, whenever we're doing our day-to-day tasks, whenever we're doing things at church and whatever is who are we doing this for? Are we preaching for God, or are we preaching to be heard by men? Do we live to receive the praise of men after our sermons? Are we, content to do the best that we can and to be saying, this was for God? And that's the way we have to think if we're going to practice this love that we read about in 1 Corinthians 13. I'm telling you, it's a foreign way of thinking to those who have been raised to think carnally minded.
Absolutely.
This is spiritual mindedness.
Yeah.
And it's something we got to work at.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Absolutely, we do. And so many things. Philippians chapter 2, when it's describing what Christ did for us, right? When he left the habitation of the glories of heaven, the glory that he had with the Father, and he came to this earth and made himself a servant, even to the point of death, right? And it says there, have this mind in you that put the things of others ahead of the things of yourself. Think about those around you. And
that's verse 5, Philippians 2:5. Let this mind be in you.
Right. And so do things the way Christ, did them. And then you've got so many other examples, but you go back to the Good Samaritan, for example. Right? You look at the example of the Good Samaritan when he came to Jesus. When the Pharisee came to Jesus asking, hey, what am I doing? What do I need to do? And he talks about the great commandments. And he said, but who is my neighbor, right? Because Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, wait a minute now. Who is my neighbor? And he gave the illustration of the Good Samaritan. And the point wasn't to answer the question, who is my neighbor? The point that I'm convinced Jesus was making to this man is, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, whose neighbor are you? Right? How are you treating those that you find beaten and left for dead? How are you treating those that you come across in dire situations? How are you treating those who would be considered that maybe that hate you and would despise you and would have crossed the street and walked the other way? How are you treating them? How are you being a neighbor to those around you? And so whose neighbor are you? And that's the point that I think Jesus is making with that particular parable, to illustrate to this lawyer the attitude that we are to have and how we are to think of the things of others ahead of ourselves. The idea, and there's a little kid song that I remember being sung, Joy, Joy, and what that means. And that means that's Jesus first, yourself last, and others in between. Right? That is what true joy is all about. But that boils down to the love that we have for those around us, how we treat them. And Richard, this is something that I think is vitally important for us to understand. The world looks at love and says that if you're correcting, you're rebuking, you're reproving someone who's in sin, that's not loving. And the world has that completely wrong.
Exactly. I mean, first of all, you got to understand this. 1 John 4 says God is love. And so we take that. That's a given. God is love. And so then we go to 1 Corinthians 13 and we have a detailed explanation of what God is. And so when we're thinking about God, we can come right here and look at and read this passage like we already did. And we can see what kind of love God does portray, what God is all about. We couple that with what we read about Jesus in the four Gospels, along with the approved examples of the apostles, the Apostle Paul, for instance. And we learn more about how these things are manifested. And so when we see all these things, Chris, we understand that if we don't adopt that same mindset, then if we don't like this, if we don't like this type of love, then guess what? We don't like God. Because what you just described is a commandment of God. In First Corinthians chapter 5, for instance, we've seen that commandment about the man who had his father's wife and how there was a discipline that was to take place, in the church. And many people, you're right, many people say, oh, you shouldn't judge him. You're making a judgment upon him. But this is the commandments of God. And God is telling us how to love him. He's telling us how to love the church. He's telling us how to love that man. And this is what we're supposed to do. And like I said at the very beginning, love is not easy. The kind of love the world has is not easy. But the kind of love Jesus wants us to do is really not easy. This is a cross. I mean, this is definitely a something that you're going to have to work at. And so while it's not easy to go to somebody's house and sit down at their dining room table and talk to them about sin and in some cases rebuke them, that has to be done. And the reason it's done is not because you think you're better than them. The reason it has to be done is because you see yourself as their servant and you want to help them get to heaven. And the only way you know how to do that is to point out the error and to try to help them get back on the straight and narrow. That's the only way that can be manifested. You're right, Chris. So many people have redefined God, redefined Jesus Christ to something that they want. They've rebuilt Jesus. I'll tell you this story, and this happened. A man at church told me this. His mother was a Baptist, and they were talking about Jesus one day, and she was describing different things about him, and he was just shaking his head, and he made this observation. He said, he goes, we just don't even worship the same Jesus. They're just two different beings. And that's the truth. I mean, for many people, they have reinvented Jesus. They have not gone to the scriptures to find out what he is all about. And if they have, they didn't like what they saw, but they decided to make their own Jesus. And again, that's not going to profit you anything. We need to learn about Jesus, and to learn about his love is to learn. I mean, that's who he is. And if you don't like that, if you don't like that kind of love, then unfortunately, you don't like God.
Mm-hmm.
And that's most unfortunate.
And that's what First John even points out, right? If you don't love your neighbor, you don't love God.
How many people have you heard say, I don't like going to church?
Yeah.
Or I don't like doing this or that or whatnot. You got to, you have to love serving God. You have to love serving others. And so even though that may not be something that you would prefer to do if you were living carnally minded, you understand and you can recognize that's the carnal part in you, and you're putting that aside and you're wanting to be spiritual. And so you do something that the carnal mind wouldn't want to do. I'll give you a good example is there was a man one time that I went door to door, and he was out grilling. And we talked about the church, and he was familiar with the church at Kearney. He knew where it was. And he was thinking about coming down. He was asking questions. And then he said, well, let me ask you one thing. He said, do I have to be there on Sunday mornings? And I was like, well, yes. I mean, we're commanded to assemble. And he's like, well, I can't go there then. And I'm like, why? And he said, well, because I got season tickets to the Chiefs. And he goes, I'm not giving those up. He said, that comes first. So you see, That's what happens whenever that's the same thing, Chris, that happened to the rich young man. You
Mm.
know, there was something that was preventing him from following Jesus, and that was his money. And so, with all of us, there's usually something that we have to give up in order to follow Jesus. But if you love him, then, as Paul said, he had so much to profit from as a Pharisee. He was willing to give. He counted it, as the scripture says, it counted it as dung for the love of Christ. And that has to be our attitude.
Yeah. And as much as you want to say that you love God and that you love Jesus, if you're treating those around you with disdain and contempt, then you're a liar. You don't truly love God or those, or Christ. If you're treating those around you with contempt and disdain and looking down your nose at them, you can say it all you want, but you're a liar. You do not truly love God if you do not love those around you. And so, we've got to take to heart this idea of how love is described and make it the application in our lives from First Corinthians chapter 13 to understand all these other passages and realize that when we rebuke, when we try to correct someone with the word of God, we're not doing so to try and say, hell, look, we're right, you're wrong. We're doing so, as you pointed out, Richard, for the salvation of souls, not only yours, but ours as well, right? We will be held accountable if we're not speaking out and trying to help others to make correction in their own life. We need to do it with love, because Paul even pointed out, very beginning of chapter 13, that he serves God, he serves others, or even gives himself. If he does it without love, it is of no profit at all. And so, we've got to have this love that Christ had for us, which not only looks to the things of others, but tries to help them in their life. And people want to run to Matthew chapter 7 verse 1 and say, oh, look, it says judge not. Well, continue the reading, because he says not only does it not just say don't judge, he goes on to say, don't judge wrongly, right? Here's how you're supposed to judge. Don't be a hypocrite. Remove the plank in your own eye so that you can help the brother who has a speck in his eye. And you do that because you love them, right? And you love God and you love those around you. Richard, you got any last thoughts for today?
Yeah, one thing. And that is when he talks about in first, and this kind of goes off the track a little bit, but not too far. But in 1 Corinthians 13:5, about love, it says, thinks no evil. Um, you know, and this just kind of goes to a point. We really, what put Jesus on the cross was he believed in the best we could be. He really wanted to see the best that we had to offer. And he believes it's possible, or he wouldn't have preached it. He wouldn't have made it possible. But he really thinks that Richard can be way better than what Richard's doing. And so I think, Chris, if we're going to practice that same type of love, if we're going to serve each other, then we have to have that same belief in each other. We need to look at each other and believe the way Jesus believed in us, that we believe in the very best they can be. And so with that, we're going to serve them in such a way as to make that possible, because we believe in that. We believe they can fulfill all expectations that God has.
Yeah. Man, that's a smack in the face, brother. You know what? That hits hard. That's what we need to hear.
There is nothing about Christ's love that's easy. Yeah. This is something, if you want to be like the Son of God, then you got to practice these things, and it's hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks, we appreciate everybody tunes in, listens to Berean Spirits, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on Facebook, whether it is, afterwards, as far as the podcast is concerned. We love hearing from you guys. Shoot us an email, bereanspirits@gmail.com. And until next time, remember to search the scriptures with Berean spirits.
Well, folks, that's all for today. Don't worry. Lord willing, the guys will be back next week for another Bible study on Berean spirits. Until then, let the guys hear from you. Drop them some email at bereanspirits@gmail.com. They'd love to hear from you. Until next time, let's keep studying that Bible.